Chapter 19 of The Lady of the North Star by Ottwell Binns. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Husband and Wife. It was the end of the day, and Joy Gargrave, kneeling down on a litter of young spruce boughs in the shadow of a windscreen, stretched her mittened hands towards the fire. Then she removed her face mask and looked at her foster sister, who, having changed her moccasins, was placing the pair she had worn through the day near the fire where they would dry slowly. "Tired, Babette?" "Not more than ordinary," was the reply, "though I will own to having found those last 2 miles against the wind a little trying." They had been traveling for a week, and were growing used to the evil of the trail. Body stiffness no longer troubled them, and having been inured to the task from childhood, the agony of cramp brought on by the snowshoe work was unknown to them, the hard exercise of the trail inducing no more than a healthy tiredness at the end of the day. Joy stretched herself luxuriously on the spruce and looked around. The darkness of the woods was behind them, and in front the waste of snow showed dimly. In the circle of firelight the Indian George was preparing the evening meal, while his son Jim was feeding the dogs. The girl watched them meditatively for a moment or two, then she spoke to Miss Lafarge. "A little different to the Ritz, Babette." Babette looked up from the steaming moccasins. "What do you mean, Joy?" Joy waved her hand in half circle. "Why, everything. The trees, the snow, the darkness, the dogs, the camp fire, George and Jim, and you and I like a couple of Dianas." Babette laughed and looked round appreciatively. "It makes me think of a picture which I saw when we were in London. It had a fancy name, 'When the World was Young,' or something like that, and whoever painted it knew the wilderness well. It is, as you say, a little different to the Ritz, and ever so much better. I wonder how long we shall be on trail. Not that I'm tired of it. Even hard work has its pleasures and compensations." "I do not know how long we shall be. I am content that we are on the right trail. The strange Indian with whom George talked to day told a story of a white man, an officer of police, who had been taken to the winter camp of his tribe with a broken leg. The leg had healed, and the officer had departed 10 days ago on the trail of a bad white man, and he went northward. From the description given, the officer was almost certainly Corporal Bracknell, and I have an idea that he may have news of Dick Bracknell, and be following his trail, in which case I pray that we may come up with him soon. For if there was trouble between them, and the corporal killed his cousin, it would be a very terrible thing, in view of the situation as regards the succession to Harrow Fell." "Yes," answered Miss Lafarge slowly, "but it is no use shutting one's eyes to facts. The death of Dick Bracknell would be a relief to many people, yourself included." "It would be no relief to me if Dick Bracknell died by his cousin's hand," answered Joy in a low voice. "It would be quite terrible. It is more than I dare contemplate." "Why?" As Babette Lafarge shot the question at her foster sister, she looked at her keenly, and saw a wave of warm blood surge over the beautiful face. And as she saw it, her own grew suddenly tender. "No," she added hurriedly, "don't answer the question, Joy. There's no need. I can guess the answer, which I am sure you would not give me. I think you are right. For everybody's sake, nothing must happen between those 2 men. At all costs that must be prevented." She dropped the moccasins, took a couple of steps forward, and stopped, kissing Joy's warm cheek. "My dear," she said, "you must not worry. Time will unravel this dreadful tangle. And after all you are young yet." Joy looked up at her, trying bravely to smile, but there was the gleam of unshed tears in her eyes. She was about to speak when the servant George announced that supper was ready, and she contented herself with a glance that was full of love and gratitude. The next morning, just before they broke camp, the younger Indian, who had been out inspecting the trail, returned with news. He had been a little way up the river and had encountered a strange Indian in the act of taking a marten from a trap. He had talked with this man, and when the latter had heard who his mistress was, he had betrayed considerable excitement, and had asked him to wait for him a little time, as he might have a message for his mistress. He had gone away, and a little later had returned, and had then told Jim that his master, a white man, was lying sick in a cabin on a creek a little way up the river, and that he earnestly desired that Miss Gargrave would go and speak with him. "Did he give his master's name?" asked Joy, as a quick hope awoke within her. "No, miss, but he have yours. He say you know him, and I wonder if he is the man we seek." Joy also wondered and hoped, and after consideration she nodded her head. "Yes, I will go and see this man. He may be Corporal Bracknell, or he may have seen him recently. In any case, it is a Christian charity to visit any stricken white man in this desolate bush, and it will mean only a short delay. Where is the creek, Jim?" "Up the river a little way, miss. The man he waits at the point where it joins the river." "Then Miss Lafarge and I will go on ahead, and you can come on behind. If you do not overtake us, you can await us at the mouth of the creek." The two girls started off, and presently reached the creek, where, stamping his feet in the snow, Dick Bracknell's man Joe awaited them. Both of them glanced at him keenly, but he was a stranger to them, and then Joy addressed him. "Your master, where is he?" The Indian pointed up the creek. "Him sick man. I take you to him." Without waiting for further words, the man turned in his tracks and swung up the creek at such a pace that the two girls had hard work to keep up with him. Joy questioned the man as to his master's name, but the man either did not or would not understand, for he merely shook his head and pressed forward. In a few minutes they reached the little cabin at the edge of the trees, and maintaining a wooden face, the Indian swung the door open and motioned them to enter. Joy pressed forward eagerly, with her foster sister at her heels. The Indian softly closed the door behind them, an evil smile wrinkling his scarred face. Then going to the rear of the hut, a moment later he appeared with a bow and some arrows in his hand, and entering the shadow of the trees, he began to walk towards the mouth of the creek. As she entered the cabin, Joy Gargrave looked quickly about her. The only light came through a parchment window and from the improvised stove, and in the semi-darkness at first she could see nothing, but after a moment she discerned a tall figure standing but a little way from her. The face was in shadow, and she could not make out the features, but as her eyes fell on him, the man gave vent to a thin, choking laugh. "Good morning, my dear Joy. This is an unexpected pleasure." At the sound of the voice, Joy started, and with a dawning fear in her eyes, leaned forward and stared into the haggard face before her. As she did so, her fear increased, and she asked suddenly, "Who are you, that you should address me in that way?" "Then you do not recognize me?" asked the voice mockingly. "I am not surprised. Time has wrought inevitable changes, but of course it does not change the constant heart. Look again, my dear, and you will see." Overwhelming fear surged in the girl's heart. She knew who this haggard man was. Indeed, she had known from the first word that he had spoken. And now she turned abruptly towards the door as if to flee. The door was closed, and as she stretched a hand towards the wooden latch, a thin crackling laugh broke out again. "The door is fastened, my dear Joy, on the outside. I remember how you ran from me at Alcombe, and when I arranged this joyous meeting I foresaw that you might be startled, that you might try to repeat that old folly. Therefore I took steps, and my man Joe keeps the door outside. But I am glad to see you, dear wife. most unfeignedly glad to see you, and there is no need that you should hurry away. Indeed, I am afraid that until I give permission for you to go, you will have to remain here." "What do you want?" asked Joy, striving in vain to keep her voice steady. "What do I want?" There was an accent of mock surprise in Dick Bracknell's voice as he echoed the question, and then he laughed again in a way that made the girl shiver. What a question to ask a husband who has not seen his wife since his marriage morning. Really, my dear, such a question ought to be quite unnecessary. He broke off as his cough took him, and for half a minute he was shaken by it, and could not speak. When he resumed, it was in a different tone. "Sit down," he said. "I want to talk to you, and there is no need that you stand on ceremony in your husband's house. I regret the scarcity of chairs, but there is a log by the fire there, and if you will accept the advice of an expert, you will throw off your furs. You won't? Well, self-will is one of the characteristics of your sex, and no doubt you will please yourself. But all the same, allow me to express my gratitude to you that you should have left your home in midwinter to come and look for me. Such solicitude is beyond what I had "I was not looking for you," Joy broke in. "You are the last person I was expecting to meet." "Is that so?" The mockery had gone out of Bracknell's voice now, and there was a dangerous ring in it. The eyes in the haggard face were blazing, and to both the girls it was clear that he had much ado to keep himself in hand. "You dare tell me that, me, your lawful husband? Perhaps you will tell me for whom you did leave your home then? Whom were you following and seeking on a winter trail?" Joy felt her face flush suddenly. Could she tell him? She asked herself, and immediately her mind answered no. In the wild mood that was on him, Dick Bracknell would be sure to put a false interpretation on any explanation that she might offer him. Realizing this, she was silent, and a moment later he broke out again, wrathfully. "You won't tell me? You're ashamed to tell me, I suppose. But accept my assurances that there is no need. I already know. My cousin Roger is the favored man, is he not?" "You start at that? Then it is all true what I have heard, that not only is he to supplant me at Harrow Fell, but in my wife's affections also. Well, that is not going to happen. I will have Harrow Fell and you also, and you first, my Joy, for there shall be no cuckoo in my nest. Yes, I will have Harrow Fell. I can face 5 years at Portland, or at Parkhurst for that. But first I will have you. You are here in your husband's house, where you have come of your own accord, and here you remain. Take off your furs." To Joy it was clear that Dick Bracknell was almost insanely jealous, and her face blanched as the possibilities of the situation flashed themselves upon her. The man took a step forward as if to enforce his order, and she shrank back against the rough logs of the shack. Bracknell laughed savagely, but the next moment there came an intervention. "Stand back, Mr. Bracknell." The speaker was Miss Lafarge, and as she stepped resolutely forward, holding a small but serviceable looking machine pistol in her hand, Dick Bracknell came to a standstill. "What?" "Do as I tell you. Lay a finger on Joy and I will shoot you. She may be your wife, but she is my more than sister, and I will brook no violence from you." Bracknell looked at her irresolutely. It was very clear to him that she would keep her word, and after a moment he stepped back and laughed to cover his discomfiture. "A she lynx with claws. Well, time is on my side. You will grow tired of standing there, and Joe will be back in a minute or two. Then I shall know how to deal with you." Babette did not even reply to him. She glanced at the door and addressed herself to Joy. "Try and open the door, Joy." Joy sprang to the door and lifting the wooden latch tugged hard at the door. Dick Bracknell watched her with amused eyes, and when all her efforts failed, he spoke again. "It is no use, my dear Joy. The door is fastened on the outside. We are all prisoners until Joe returns." "No," replied Miss Lafarge stubbornly, "not until then. Our men will be here in a few minutes if we do not meet them at the mouth of the creek. Then—" A sharp cry of agony sounded somewhere outside, and as it reached them the girl's speech suddenly froze. "What was that?" asked Joy, looking at Bracknell. A deep frown had come upon his face, and there was apprehension in his voice as he replied, I do not know. Some one may have been hurt. He was still speaking haltingly when the crash of a rifle broke on his words, followed by a shout, and that in turn by a great stillness. The three people in the shack looked at one another helplessly. The girls' faces were white, and Bracknell's features showed wrathful. In silence they waited, and nothing further happened. Half an hour passed, during which the girls whispered to each other, and still the silence outside was maintained, and to those in the cabin it seemed to hold a menace of mysterious things. Another half hour crept by, and then Bracknell spoke hoarsely. "Something must have happened, or the Indian would have been back before this. And your men, you say they were to meet you at the mouth of the creek?" "Yes," answered Joy composedly, "and no doubt they are waiting there now." "I am afraid not," answered her husband. "Something has occurred. What? We must find out." He glanced at the window of skin parchment, then added, "That is our only way. We must cut that out. One of us must climb through and open the door." "Joy shall go," said Miss Lafarge firmly. "It doesn't matter who goes. This is a business of life and death. There is an axe in the corner there. If one of you will use it, I shall be obliged. I am afraid that the state of my lungs does not permit much exertion on my part." Babette looked at Joy, who, finding the axe, attacked the window, and a moment later the freezing air drove into the cabin. When the rough frame was quite clear, the man nodded at her. His manner was now very quiet, and betrayed nothing of the jealous rage which had possessed him an hour ago. "Go through, Joy. Take the axe with you. You may need it to knock out the stable. Have no fear," he said, as she visibly hesitated. "I give you my word that this is no trap. Believe me, I am very anxious for the safety of all of us." Joy glanced once at him. It was plain to her that he was sincere, and 2 seconds later she climbed to the window and dropped down into the snow. A minute later the door swung open, and she was joined by Babette and Dick Bracknell. All three stood there looking down the creek. No sound reached them. Everywhere was the appalling, inscrutable silence of the northern wilderness. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Lady of the North Star by Ottwell Binns. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Dick Bracknell learns the truth. "We must find out what has happened," said Joy, looking at Bracknell. "Yes," he said slowly, "but you must not go alone. If you will wait a moment, I will accompany you." "But your cough," Joy began, a tone of solicitude in her voice. "My cough?" Dick Bracknell laughed bitterly. "That is nothing to what may lie before us, and in any case it is not safe for you to go alone." Something in his voice and manner convinced her that he was not speaking idly, and that he had his own reason for apprehension. "Very well," she said, "we will wait for you. We will go down the creek together." He turned back into the hut, and the two girls looked at each other. They were used to the stillness of the forest, but somehow the silence that prevailed seemed ominous of fateful things. Both of them were conscious of vague forebodings, and as Babette looked at her foster sister and saw the light of apprehension in her eyes, she whispered, "What do you think, Joy? What do you think has happened?" "I do not know, but I feel that it is something dreadful, and I am afraid." She looked towards the cabin and added, "He is afraid also. You can see that." "Yes, that is very clear." They stood waiting until Dick Bracknell appeared, and then without speaking all three started down the creek. A few minutes' walking brought them in sight of the main trail, and suddenly Joy gave a cry and pointed ahead. The figure of a man was lying prone in the snow, and as he caught sight of it, Dick Bracknell broke into a feeble run. For a moment the two girls stood quite still, looking each at the blanched face of the other. Then they followed slowly, the premonition of tragedy mounting in their hearts. When they reached Bracknell, they found him stooping over the figure, with a look of consternation in his eyes. "Do you know him? Is it your—" "Oh," cried Babette, "it is George." "George? Who's—" "He was my father's man, and he is mine," said Joy, staring at the fallen Indian with stricken eyes. "No," said Dick Bracknell quietly, "he is yours no longer. He has gone to the happy hunting grounds." "Dead!" cried Joy, as the truth broke upon her. "George dead! But how? What?" Bracknell looked up at her, moved by the anguish in her tones. Then he pointed to what she had not seen, a feathered arrow head half hidden by the crook of the arm. "Oh," she sobbed, "he has been killed. He—" "But where is Jim? Where are the dogs?" cried her foster sister. "Both have been here. See, here are the tracks, and there goes the trail northward." It was as she said, and as Dick Bracknell looked down and read the signs, a dark look came on his face. Babette looked from her foster sister, sobbing in the snow, to the man who was her husband. "What do you think has happened?" she asked. He looked from her to Joy commiseratingly. "I can only guess," he said in a troubled voice. "I think the Indian who is with me is responsible for this. The man who brought you to my shack. You know, when you came to the cabin he had instructions to look out for your men at the mouth of the creek. I'm afraid he exceeded my instructions. I think that he must have attacked your men." "But why should he do that, if you did not tell him?" As Joy flung this question at him, a troubled look came upon his face. "I think he wanted your dogs and outfit, that we might get away from here." "Our dogs and outfit?" "Yes, he is devoted to me, but twice lately I have had trouble on that point. Once when my cousin Roger Bracknell came—" He broke off suddenly as Joy sprang to her feet. "Your cousin Roger has been here?" she cried. "He is alive then?" As she flung her questions at him eagerly, impetuously, the man's face clouded, and again a jealous light came in his eyes. It was a moment before he answered the question, and to Babette watching him it appeared that he was struggling hard for self-mastery. "Yes," he replied at last in a hoarse voice, "he is alive. He came to my cabin by accident. He had broken his leg and had lain in an Indian encampment for weeks. Then he had heard news which had sent him hotfoot on the trail of a man who was responsible for your father's death." "For my father's death?" As she cried the words, Joy's face was white as the snow about her. But her voice faltered, and guessing what she would have said, Bracknell explained. "I am afraid it will come as a shock to you even after these 3 or 4 years, but it appears to be the fact that your father's death was not altogether accidental. My cousin had a very circumstantial story of the affair, and he was on the trail of the man who is responsible for the crime, the same man, as he believes, who shot me on the night when I had arranged that meeting with you at North Star." "But who is the man?" asked Joy quickly. "My cousin gave me no name. Indeed he declined to do so. But he had his theory, and he went so far as to tell me that not only did the Indian who was with him know the man, but that he himself believed that he knew him." "Ah!" cried Joy. Her husband looked at her. "You also guess?" "Yes," she answered, "I guess, but no more than a guess." "Who is the man?" asked Bracknell quickly. "His name is Adrian Rayner." "Rayner!" cried Bracknell excitedly. "The son of old Rayner, your guardian?" "Yes. He is in the North now. I believe that he is looking for Roger Bracknell." "God in heaven!" "What is the matter?" asked Joy. "You look as if something had occurred to you." "Yes," he said simply, "something has. Something very significant." 2 or 3 days after Roger left the shack, a stranger arrived. "Mr. Bracknell," interrupted Miss La Farge, "don't you think we had better postpone explanations for a little time? If we remain talking here we shall freeze, and there are things to be done. There is Jim to find, and there is the team and the outfit. Then we must bury George. We can't possibly leave him lying here for the wolves." "Yes," answered Bracknell, "I was forgetting." He considered a moment and then spoke again. "The sled tracks run up the river. If you two were to follow a little way till you get to that spur there, you will have a long view of the trail, and possibly you will be able to see something of the team and your man. But don't go too far, it won't be safe. While you are away I will arrange tree burial for this poor fellow, and when you return we can discuss the situation. Do you agree?" "Yes," answered Joy. "Then I will waste no time, nor I hope will you." He turned and began to walk up the creek in a way that revealed what an effort it was for him, and for a second or two Joy watched him with pitying eyes. Then as her foster sister spoke, she turned and without answering began to follow the sled tracks. After they had trudged a little way, Babette spoke. "Dick Bracknell is a strange man. 2 hours ago he was within an act of violence towards you, and now I believe he is really solicitous for your welfare." "Yes," answered Joy, "he is full of contradictions. There are many men like him, I suppose. When he is good he is very good, and when he is bad he is almost satanic. When I first met him he was a gentleman and an attractive one. But for unfortunate influences he might have continued. But now—" "Now he is a wreck, physical and moral," answered Babette, and then asked sharply, "Suppose we do not find Jim and the dogs, Joy?" "We must find them." "But suppose we do not? What then?" "Then we shall have to take refuge in the cabin." She said no more, and Babette asked no more questions. In half an hour they reached the wooded spur round which the river turned, and as they reached the further side, both came to a standstill and looked at the frozen waste. For 2 or 3 miles the course of the river was visible between low wooded banks. Snow was everywhere, and nowhere was the white surface broken by any moving figure. It was a land of death, death white and cold. Babette shivered as she looked on it. "They are not here, Joy," she whispered, "neither Jim nor the dogs." "No," answered Joy stonily. "We shall have to go back to the cabin, to your husband." "Yes, there is no other way." A sob broke from her. Then she bit her lip and added, "It is a strange irony that now my safety should depend on him." "Dare you trust him, Joy?" "Yes," answered Joy thoughtfully, "I can trust him now. As you have seen, he is a very sick man, and in spite of the way in which he raved in the cabin, I believe that now he is greatly concerned for my safety and yours." "Did you notice a sudden change in his attitude after I mentioned Adrian Rayner's name?" "Yes, he was startled. His manner completely altered. Something struck him with your mention of the name. I wonder what it was." "I do not know. I cannot even guess. But no doubt we shall hear presently. There is nothing for us to do but to return to the cabin." Her foster sister nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, we shall have to do that. We can do nothing else." She paused a moment and then asked, "You don't think George, his son, has deserted us, Joy?" "No," answered Joy emphatically. "Something has driven him away, but he will return if he can. I am sure of that." They turned in their tracks and slowly retraced their way to the cabin. Dick Bracknell was standing at the door, evidently waiting for them, and as they approached he flashed a look of inquiry at Joy. She shook her head. "No," she said quietly, "there is nothing to be seen anywhere." "I am sorry," answered Bracknell simply. "You must wait here. Perhaps your other man will return, or if he does not, my man may." He opened the door and held it for them to pass in. "You can take off your furs," he said as they entered. "I have blocked the window with snow, and stretched a blanket over it. I am afraid that it will be rather dark, but that is unavoidable." The two girls followed his suggestion, and seated themselves by the stove. For a little time no one spoke, and the red glow of the fire shining on their faces showed them very thoughtful. At last Joy broke the silence. "You were saying that 2 or 3 days after your cousin left here a stranger arrived. Who was it? Do you know?" Dick Bracknell laughed mirthlessly. "I do not know for certain. I can only guess." "And you guess?" "That it was old Rayner's son, Adrian, I think you called him. Of course he didn't tell me who he was, but he let out that he was looking for my cousin Roger, and posed as a lawyer's clerk. I'm morally certain, however, that he was young Rayner." Joy remembered his sudden change of manner when she had said that Adrian Rayner was in the North, looking, as she believed, for Roger Bracknell, and after a moment, urged by something deeper than curiosity, she spoke. "You hinted that something very significant had occurred to you. What was it?" Dick Bracknell hesitated, and it was evident that he was wondering whether to tell her or not. Then he laughed bitterly. "You may as well know all the kinds of fool I am. This stranger pitched a yarn about you and Roger, and I was fool enough to believe him." He broke off and looked at Joy, whose face was flaming. Even in the red glow of the firelight the flush revealed itself to him. But though he frowned a little, he continued in an even voice. "He told me that my brother Geoffrey was dead, and that I was either dead or as good as dead. Roger quite naturally was reckoned as the heir the Harrow fell. He said further that you knew of this, and that you were looking for Roger, with the news, and with the intention of marrying him." "Oh!" As the exclamation broke from her, Joy abruptly hid her face in her hands. Bracknell coughed a little and then resumed. "He claimed to be the agent of old Rayner, and declared he was looking for Roger Bracknell in order to warn him of your previous marriage, and to give him warning that I was alive, in case you should not regard that marriage as binding." He looked at Joy again. Her face was still hidden in her hands. "As I said, I was fool enough to believe him, and that accounts for my amiable reception of you just now. It even accounts for your presence here, for when my man Joe brought news that you were out in the Northwest Trail, the trail that Roger was following, I was morally certain that you were out upon his track, and I set out to trap you. You must own that your unexpected presence did give color to Rayner's story, and that I had some excuse for—" "I was looking for your cousin Roger," interrupted Joy, suddenly lifting her face and meeting his questioning gaze. He looked at her, but did not immediately reply. And in the silence that followed, Miss La Farge rose from her seat and began to put on her furs. "I am going outside," she said. "It is better that I should. You two have things to say to each other that should only be said between you." She passed out, shutting the door behind her, and after a little time Dick Bracknell spoke again. "You say you were looking for my cousin Roger. That is a very damaging admission, is it not? It would seem that, after all, that fellow Rayner was not far off the mark." "You did not believe that?" answered Joy, meeting his gaze with steady eyes. He laughed shortly. "No," he admitted, "I do not believe it now. But I will own that I am a little curious as to the reason why you should follow my cousin's trail. It is a little unusual." "I was following him, as I believed, to save him. Adrian Rayner wanted to marry me, and I had accused him of trying to kill you at North Star. He knew all about my marriage to you, though how he got that knowledge I cannot tell." "That is simple enough," broke in her husband. "I wrote to old Rayner and told him." "But my uncle did not know. I am sure he did not know. He himself wanted me to marry Adrian, and I can't believe he knew." "Perhaps not," admitted Bracknell thoughtfully. "It is possible that young Rayner got hold of my letter to his father, and that the old man never saw it at all. But what has this to do with my cousin?" "This. Adrian Rayner told me that he was coming here in order to prove that you were dead, but I was morally certain that he was coming here to find your cousin Roger and to shoot him. Hey? Why should he want to do that?" "Because he knew that your cousin suspected him of that attempt on your life at North Star." "Wanted to get rid of a witness, I suppose. "And you were following Roger to warn him?" "Yes, that was one reason." It's a nice coil for sure. I entertained the man who tried to murder me, and I set him on the trail of my cousin who is trying to bring him to justice. That is about as pretty a kettle of fish as—" "But you did not tell Adrian Rayner where Roger had gone," cried Joy, springing to her feet. "Surely you did not tell him?" "At the time," answered Bracknell slowly, "it seemed to me that I had little cause to love my cousin Roger. You are to remember that I was in ignorance of much that I have learned this morning." "You told him?" cried Joy. "I certainly put him on the track," answered the man. "Then God forgive you! God forgive you!" cried Joy in anguished tones. Dick Bracknell's face set hard, and only by an effort was he able to control himself. But after a moment he replied quietly, "As I have said, I did not know Rayner. I had no inkling of his game." "No," said Joy stonily, "I understand that." "You hinted that there was another reason," said Bracknell, watching her closely. "I wonder if you would mind telling me?" "Oh, I don't mind at all," broke in Joy impulsively. "Your brother Geoffrey was killed while I was in England. Indeed, I was the one to find him dead. No one knew whether you were alive or dead. Even I did not know, and Roger was regarded as the heir. But I knew that when he left North Star that he was going to try and learn what had really happened to you, and I was afraid that if there was a collision between you and anything dreadful happened, people might say that he—" She broke off and hesitated. "I understand," said her husband. "You need not say it. I dare say you are quite right. This world is full of Christian charity. I cabled him and tried to get in touch with him. I learned that he was missing. I came out, and at Regina I discovered that nothing whatever had been heard about him. But I discovered also that Adrian Rayner had been making inquiries, and that he was on his trail. Then I was certain of his evil purpose, and when I reached North Star and found Adrian there, I accused him, for I was very sure of his intentions. As soon as I could I started to look for your cousin myself." "You seem very anxious about my cousin," broke in her husband quietly. "Oh, how can I help being?" cried Joy. Dick Bracknell took a step forward and put a hand on her shoulder. She did not shrink, and as his eyes searched her face she met his gaze steadily. They stood there silent for what seemed a long time. Then Bracknell dropped his hand. "I think I understand," he said wearily, "and I do not blame you. And I am sure that both Roger and you have played the game. Well, I'm crocked, and—" He broke off and laughed harshly. Then his haggard face grew suddenly convulsed with rage. "That Rayner! If only I could meet him again I think I could die happily." Joy looked at him, her heart wrung with pity for him. She stretched a hand impulsively and was about to speak when the door was flung open violently, and Miss La Farge rushed in, hastily barring the door behind her. Chapter 21. Of the Lady of the North Star by Ottwell Binns. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Under cover of night. She stood there, gasping for breath and unable to speak, and to both the others in the cabin it was evident that something startling had occurred. Dick Bracknell found his tongue first. "What is the matter, Miss La Farge? What has happened?" Babette found her breath and cried pantingly, "Some one tried to kill me." "To kill you?" her listeners cried together incredulously. "Yes, I was walking down the creek, wondering where Jim and our dogs were gone to, when I heard a sharp sound, just like the twang of a bowstring, and looked round. I could see nothing, and the woods on the banks were quite still and silent. Nothing moving anywhere. I was still looking and convincing myself that I had imagined the sound, when it occurred again, and a second later an arrow struck a tree close by me, and remained there quivering. I did not remain to see any more, or to try and learn who had sent it. I turned in my tracks and ran back here, and once as I ran An arrow passed clean through my parka, and buried itself in the snow beyond." Dick Bracknell broke out suddenly. "Confound it!" he cried. "This is intolerable. That Indian Joe must have gone mad." "You think it's your man?" asked Joy quickly. "I'm sure of it. Who else can it be in this God forsaken wilderness? It must be he, but I will find out soon." He moved towards the door and throwing down the bar, opened it. There was nothing visible but the snow and the dark woods. He took a step forward, and as he did so something came swishing through the air and struck the doorpost. He knew what it was before he saw it, and cried out, "Joe, you confounded fool, what—" The sharp crack of a rifle broke in on the words, and a bullet cut the fur off his coat at the top of the shoulder. He turned quickly round and tumbled backwards into the cabin, kicking the door to behind him. Joy ran forward and dropped the bar in place, then looked at him. "You are hurt?" she cried anxiously. "No," he answered as he picked himself up. "Only knocked over with surprise." "But that was a rifle, wasn't it? Someone fired at you." "Yes, someone certainly did." He gave a wheezy laugh as he lifted a hand to his shoulder. "And he almost got me. He made the fur fly, and if it had struck an inch or two lower I should have been out of action for a while at any rate. He must be a rotten shot, for out there on the snow I must have been a perfect mark." "But what on earth can your man be?" "It is not Joe," broke in Bracknell with conviction. "Even if he has gone clean into lunacy he'd never do a thing like that to me. Besides, Joe has no gun with him. Our guns are there in the corner, and as we've run out of ammunition they are of no use. It simply can't be Joe." "Then who can it be? And why should they want to do a thing like that?" "It may be your other man, Jim, didn't you call him? He may have returned, and thinking you were prisoners here, may have tried to get me in hope of releasing you. But you forget the attack on Babette. Someone shot arrows at her and—" "By Jove, I had forgotten something. Stand away from the door. I'm going to open it. There's something I want to get." "Oh, be careful," cried Joy. He swung round and looked at her whimsically. Then he said quietly, "I'll be careful for your sake, not my own. I've got to get you safely out of this. That much I owe you at any rate." He turned again to the door and cautiously opening it a little way, peeped out. There was nothing visible, and quickly he opened the door wider and thrusting out an arm, gripped the arrow which was sticking in the post and hastily flung the door in place once more. Even as he did so, something crashed into the wood, and the sound of a shot reverberated through the stillness outside. The two girls looked at him. Their faces were white, and they were much alarmed. Bracknell looked at the door and laughed shortly. "It seems that we are to stand a regular siege," he said. "That man of yours is of the persevering sort." Neither Joy nor her foster sister replied, and moving towards the stove, Bracknell threw on a spruce log, and as it caught and flamed up, he stopped, and by its light he examined the arrow in his hand. Quarter of a minute later he stood up. "That settles it," he said. "This arrow is not Joe's. It's too finely made, with an ivory barb on which somebody has spent time. Joe's bow and arrows were makeshifts, and his barbs were of moose bone." "Then who can it be?" asked Joy. "Jim would have no arrows at all, and he certainly would not have fired them at Babette if he had." Dick Bracknell shook his head. "I cannot think. It may be a roving band of Indians from the far north. This arrow tells its own story. It is like those made by the Indian Eskimo in the North Behring. I've been up there, and I've seen arrows like it before." "But at least one of our attackers has a rifle," said Miss Lafarge. "Yes," answered Bracknell thoughtfully. "And why should they attack us at all?" asked Joy. "They may be out for plunder. Most of these fellows have a weakness for the possessions of white men. I've seen one of them risk his life for a woodsman's axe, and they'll give their heads for a sheath knife. They'll have seen the cabin, and may think that there are things worth having here. But in any case, they will find out the mistake in a very few days." "Why?" "Because we haven't more than 2 or 3 days' stock of food," replied Bracknell grimly. "There's only a small stock of coffee, a few beans, and some frozen moose meat. That's why I suspected Joe of trying to get your outfit. But I've changed my mind now. I think that those fellows outside may have killed your man, and Joe also, if we only knew." "Then our position is rather desperate." Bracknell nodded. "If those beggars really mean business, we're in a pretty tight corner. They may rush the cabin, or they may wait. In either case they will get us." "There is one possibility that you have not thought of yet," said Babette slowly. "What is that?" "It is that this attack may not have been made by any roving tribe at all." "But who?" "Adrian Rayner." "God in heaven!" As the exclamation broke from his lips, Dick Bracknell looked at her in amazed conviction. "Of course. I never thought of him." "He is the one man who has cause to do such a thing. He knows that Joy and I suspect him of shooting you at North Star. He wanted to marry her, and he knows that that is now out of the question altogether. But he's Joy's cousin, and Joy, as you know, is immensely wealthy. If she died up here—" "Heavens, yes! And I would stake my life that he's the man Roger is after, the man who caused your father's death. He—" "You did not tell me," cried Joy. "How did my father die?" "Someone blew up the ice on the river, the ice which he was bound to pass over in the morning. Of course the river froze over again in the night, but it was not strong enough to carry a man, let alone a man and a heavy sled team. He went through and died. But if Roger is right, he was diabolically murdered." Joy did not move. She looked at him with horror in her eyes. Then her face grew hard. "I believe your cousin Roger is right. Adrian Rayner was abroad about the time when my father must have died, and he wanted to marry me after you had been shot at North Star, though he could not have been sure of your death. It was my money he was after, and—" "He's after it yet," cried Bracknell with conviction. "Miss Lafarge is right. If you died up here— But have you made a will?" Joy shook her head. "It was never suggested to me." "No, for a very good reason. As your next of kin, Rayner and his father would step in if you died. The fellow has been working to that end all the time, and he's working now. And he's cunning, most damnably cunning. The way he arranged your father's death proves that. And if Miss Lafarge here is right, and Adrian Rayner is the man behind the gun, then we're in a hole. The fellow will show us no mercy. He—" "Shh!" As she gave the warning, Miss Lafarge lifted a hand in signal for silence, and bent forward in a listening attitude. The other two listened also, but heard nothing save the splutter and hiss of the logs on the fire. "What is it?" whispered Bracknell. "Someone walked round the cabin. I heard him quite plainly. Ah! Again!" They listened. Crunch, crunch, came the sound of footsteps in the frozen snow outside. All round the cabin the steps passed, slowly, as if someone were making an inspection. And while they sat listening, the steps receded and passed out of earshot. They looked at one another, and Bracknell was the first to break the silence. "A pretty cool customer, whoever he is. He was spying out the land." "Yes," answered Miss Lafarge in a half whisper. "I wonder what he will do," said Joy. "Nothing if he is wise," answered Bracknell slowly. "Having walked round, he'll have made the discovery that we keep our wood at the rear of the cabin, and he'll easily guess that we have no great stock inside. He has only to wait until the necessity for replenishing the stock arrives, and then he can get one of us at any rate. He'll know we have no dogs, and that we are tied to the cabin." "But are we?" interjected Joy. "Well, the open trail without dogs is a risk that few men would care to undertake. I've been at it on 1 or 2 occasions, carrying my own stores, and it's not a course to be recommended. The trail—" "But we have very few stores to pack," said Joy obstinately, "and if we stay here we shall be driven out by hunger. Do you know of any Indian tribes in the neighborhood?" Bracknell nodded. "There's an encampment 30 or 40 miles to the north on the Wolverine. Joe was talking to me about them the other day, and we considered once over whether we'd pay them a call or not. In the end we decided against it." "Why?" "Well," was the reply, "they're rather a pagan lot, and not over scrupulous. Joe was telling me that in times of scarcity they sometimes offer sacrifices." "Sacrifices? What kind of sacrifices?" "Well, the most barbaric sort human. There are some queer things done north of the Barrens, I can tell you. The world up here is still a primitive world, and the police patrol up the Mackenzie to Herschel Island can't possibly take note of anything that doesn't come right under its nose." "But the Indians cannot possibly be worse than Adrian Rayner." "No?" Bracknell laughed hoarsely. "He's a tiger for certain, though I will own he didn't look it when he was here the other day." He was silent for a moment, then he spoke slowly. "Of course if we decide to leave the cabin, and if we go north, we may stumble on my cousin Roger. It's only a chance, but " He broke off again, and looked at Joy as if wondering how she would take the suggestion, then added, "Well, we might take it if we can manage to get away from here. What do you think?" Joy hesitated. Her face flushed a little, then she said quietly, "I put myself in your hands." "Thank you. I am " A fit of coughing broke in on his speech, and when it had passed he did not attempt to complete his sentence. But as his eyes from time to time fell on her, there was a soft glow in them, which revealed an unspoken gratitude. They sat for a long time discussing the desperate situation, and late in the afternoon prepared for departure. Such food as the cabin held was made up in 3 packs, and when that was done and all was ready, they rested, waiting for the hour of departure, Joy reflecting on the strange irony of circumstances which now made her dependent for help on the man who had so wronged her, and of whom she had lived in fear. All was quiet outside, and Babette was offering a tentative suggestion that perhaps after all the enemy outside had withdrawn. Then again they caught the crunch, crunch of cautious feet on the frozen snow, and as all 3 grew alert, they heard the steps pause by the door, and the next moment there was a rustling sound on the rough woodwork. "Somebody's feeling for the latch string," whispered Bracknell. Then he hailed the intruder, as the latter, having found the string, thrust a heavy shoulder against the barred door. "Hello! Who goes there?" To this challenge there was no reply, but a second or two later they again heard the steps receding across the snow. "Came to make sure we were still here," commented Bracknell in a low voice, "and whoever he was has made a bee line from the door. That means that the camp they're sitting in is somewhere in front, and in all probability they have forgotten the window at the back, or, as it's blocked with snow, haven't noticed it. We shall be able to quit that way." They waited a little time longer, and then removed the moose hide from the window, and very cautiously began to cut away the snow with which it had been blocked. That done, they listened. No sound whatever was to be heard. Bracknell put out his head and peered into the darkness. There was nothing visible save the foreground of snow and the shadowy background of the forest. He climbed out and very cautiously crept to the corner of the cabin to reconnoiter. In the shadow of the trees on the other side of the creek he caught the glow of a fire, and discerned 3 men sitting round it. At that sight he crept back, and whispering to the 2 girls to be very careful, assisted them out of the narrow window. Then without pausing they stole quietly across to the shadow of the sheltering woods. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Lady of the North Star by Ottwell Binns. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. To the rescue. Sabu, there's someone coming up the trail. As he spoke to his native companion, Corporal Bracknell pointed down the river. The Indian paused in the very midst of what he was doing, and looked in the direction indicated. Then he nodded, and in his own speech replied, "Yes, one man and a dog team." "I wonder if by any chance it can be the man we are looking for, the man who was with you when the trail was destroyed before, Rolf Gargrave." "Who can say?" answered the Indian. "He has been long on the trail. He marches wearily." "It will be as well to take no chances. If he sees our fire, he is almost certain to make for it, and if we go back into the trees a little way, we shall be able to inspect him before he sees us. Then if he is our man, we shall get him, yes, and we will take him down to the great white chief at Regina, who will hang him. It is good. See, he has seen the fire. He is turning inward to this bank. Then we will withdraw." Corporal Bracknell stretched a hand for his rifle, and together they retreated to the undergrowth behind their camp, where, crouching low, they watched the advent of the stranger. As the newcomers' dogs moved shoreward, they began to yelp, and their own dogs, leaping up, gave tongue menacingly. The driver of the team, however, moved in front, and as one of the huskies flung itself upon the harnessed dog, brought the stock of his whip down so smartly on it that, yelping agony, it retreated. The rest of the corporal's dogs, undeterred, sprang forward, and for a moment the newcomer was the center of a huddled tangle of snarling and yelping dogs. He laid about him valiantly with his clubbed whip, but the brutes were too much for him, and at last he cried aloud for help. At the cry Sabu rose suddenly to his feet. "That night white man," he said, "he Indian." Thus assured Bracknell, and he ran to the help of the newcomer, and within 2 minutes the tangle of dogs was separated, and the three men found time to look at each other. As the stranger's eyes fell on the corporal, he gave a sudden cry of joy and relief, and he ran to him. "You know me. I come from North Star. I am Jim, Miss Gargrave's man." The corporal looked at him and then recognized him. "Yes," he said, "I know you. You are Indian George's son. What—" He was interrupted by a stream of words, half incoherent, half intelligible, which, as it flowed on, made his face grow very white. He listened carefully, trying to get a clear idea of the story which the lad was telling him, and as it ended he nodded. "I think I understand what you're trying to tell me, Jim. Someone has killed your father. Someone fired a gun at you, and you are afraid for your mistress and Miss Lafarge, and you want me to help. That is so? Very good. We are just about to have supper, and you will join us. We will eat first, and afterwards talk. I have no doubt you are very impatient, but your dogs are fagged, and so are mine. It is impossible to travel until they have rested. Feed your dogs and come along." Himself the prey of consuming anxiety, he helped prepare the evening meal, forced himself to eat, and not until he had lit his pipe did he refer to the story which the Indian lad had told him so incoherently. "Now, Jim," he said, "let us get at the facts if we can. You say that your mistress and Miss Lafarge are here in the north, and that they are on trail?" "Yes, sir." "But I thought they were in England." "They returned suddenly 14 days ago." "But what are they doing on trail, so far from home, with the spring coming?" "I do not know clearly, but they were looking for you. They had news for you. More than that was not told my father." "And you say that yestermorn a strange Indian came to your camp with a message from a white man?" "Yes, the white man was sick. He desired to talk with Miss Gargrave. So while we, my father and I, struck camp, Miss Lafarge and my mistress went to the cabin, which was on a creek." "Ah," interrupted the corporal. "Was it on the left bank?" "Yes, the left bank. The word was that we should pack and bring the dogs and the sled to the mouth of the creek there to wait for Miss Gargrave. We did so, and we were standing, stamping our feet for warmth,
when my father gave a cry like that of a man whom death strikes, and fell into the snow. I was a little way from him and ran towards him. As I reached him his spirit passed, and looking down I saw that he had been struck with an arrow." "Indians!" ejaculated the corporal. "I cannot tell. I looked about and I saw 3 men in the shadow of the wood. Their faces were hidden from me, and I could not see them clearly. One carried a rifle, which he fired at me. Our rifles, mine and that of my father's, were lashed on the sled, and I was helpless." "What did you do?" asked the corporal. "I lashed the dogs and fled, clinging to the gee pole. The trail was good and I made speed. It was in my mind that the man with the rifle would fire again, but he did not do so, though twice or thrice arrows fell near me, and I knew that I was followed. It was in my mind that when the pursuit was over I would go back, and I made for the woods on the further side of the river, and when darkness came I crept down the trail, and leaving my dogs crossed the river to the creek." "Yes, yes. What did you find?" "I found my father's body gone, and at the head of the creek, opposite a cabin, a camp was pitched and a fire lighted. And while I watched, a man left the camp and went towards the cabin. I could not see what he did, but it is in my mind that the men in the camp kept watch on the cabin." "And your mistress? Did you see anything of her?" "Nothing, but my mind says she is in the cabin, for it was thither she went to see the sick white man. I thought once to attack the camp, but the men there are 3, and I am but a stripling and unused to battle. Then I bethought me of Indians who live up the river. They are not good Indians, but my father was known to them, and I thought that maybe they might give help. I was on my way there when I caught the light of your fire, and came here, hoping to find a white man, and I find you. It is very good. You will go back? You will help?" "Yes, I shall go back. I shall help. We must save your mistress. I know the cabin on the creek, and I know the sick man whom she went to see, and I do not think she will come to any harm in that quarter. But the men in the camp, who, as you think, watch the cabin, are different. There is something there that I do not understand. But we will find out. We will rest now, and in 4 hours we start. I will feed the dogs again now, for there is a hard journey before us. The wind has changed, and the trail will soften in the morning." "Yes, it is from the south. The spring is knocking at the door, and in a week the ice will grow rotten. But before then we will find my mistress." "Yes," answered the corporal simply, "we will find her." The Indian had disposed of his blankets near the fire, and within 5 minutes was sound asleep. A little time later Sibou also slept, but Corporal Bracknell made no attempt to close his eyes, since he knew that for him sleep was impossible. He lit his pipe and sat staring into the fire, the prey of gnawing anxiety. The mystery of the men in the camp who watched Dick Bracknell's cabin utterly confounded him. Were they men whom his cousin had wronged during his none too scrupulous career in the North? That was just possible. Daily, men in those wild latitudes took the law into their own hands, enforcing verdicts that not infrequently were more just than those of the law itself. Were these men of that type? Then his mind dismissed the suggestion. In that case, why had they killed George and attacked his son, the lad who, overborne by his labors, was now sleeping there on the other side of the fire? They might be roving Indians. The use of arrows suggested that. But one had a rifle. Suddenly he sat bolt upright, his eyes staring widely, as another possibility flashed through his mind. Adrian Rayner? He was appalled at the thought, but the more he dwelt upon it, the stronger his suspicion grew. Adrian Rayner was in the North, and had 2 Indians with him, bad men, as Chief Louis had said. The corporal was morally certain that Rayner was the man who had made the attempt on Dick Bracknell at North Star, and if he knew that he were still alive, what more likely than that he should make a second attempt? There was nothing surprising about that, but the attack on Joy Gargrave's party was something that passed his comprehension altogether. Try as he would, he could find no sufficient explanation for that. The one possibility that presented itself to his mind being that Adrian Rayner was, for some reason, anxious to make Joy dependent upon himself, and so had deliberately set out to destroy her escort. Then the thought suggested itself to him that after all, that he might be building on a false assumption. The man responsible for the death of George and for the attack on the cabin might not be Rayner at all. Restlessly his mind groped among the possibilities which the mystery suggested, and not once during the 4 hours that he had decreed for rest did his eyes shut. At the end of that time he wakened Sibou, and impatient to get away himself, helped in the preparation for making a start, allowing the boy Jim to sleep until the last available moment, and when at last they took the trail, he was conscious of relief. It was at least something to feel that he was on his way to the help of Joy. They traveled 6 hours and then made a halt for a brief rest and a meal, afterwards resuming their way. As noon approached, they found the hard crust of the snow softening, and the going becoming harder, but there was no slacking of effort, and late in the afternoon they arrived at a point opposite the creek on the far side of the river. There in the shadow of the woods they waited till darkness fell, and then leaving the boy in charge of the dogs, the corporal and Sibou crossed the river and made a detour which would bring them out at the head of the creek where the cabin was located. They reached the neighborhood of their objective in about an hour's time, and then moved forward with extreme caution, looking for the camp which the boy had described as being opposite the cabin. But no glow of blazing logs met their gaze, and the edge of the forest presented a front of unbroken shadow. Sibou sniffed the air thoughtfully. "There's no smell of fire," he whispered. "No," answered the corporal, his anxiety suddenly trebled by the thought that he had arrived too late. They still crept forward, and then unexpectedly Sibou stopped and pointed to the ground. Roger Bracknell looked down and saw a blackened circle in the snow where a fire had been lit. "Here was the camp," said the Indian, and then stopped and put his hand on the ashes. "The fire is cold," he said, as he stood upright again. "It has been out for some time." For a moment they stood looking at each other, and then instinctively both turned to look for the cabin. It stood like a shadow against the deeper shadow of the woods behind it, silent, with no sign of occupation about it. "Perhaps the men we seek are in the cabin," whispered the corporal. Again the Indian sniffed the air, and then shook his head. "No, they are not there. There is no fire. But we will go and find out." Carelessly in his assurance, Sibou led the way across the creek and to the front of the cabin. The door was closed, and he hammered on it with his rifle butt. There was no answer, and feeling for the latch string, he thrust a shoulder against the door. It did not yield. "The door is barred," he said aloud, "but there is no one within, or if there is, they be dead." "The window!" ejaculated the corporal, and began to run around the cabin. Reaching the window, and observing the empty framework, he felt for his matches, and then hoisting himself up, with head and shoulders inside the cabin, he struck a light, and looked hastily round. The cabin was empty. With something like a groan of despair, he slipped back to the ground and looked at Sibou. "There is no one here," he said. "They are gone." The Indian nodded and stared at the empty frame thoughtfully. Then, after a little time, he spoke. "The men of the camp are gone, and those who were in the hut are gone. Whither we know not. But those who were in the hut went out not by the door, for the door is barred within. How did they leave the cabin then?" He jerked a hand upwards towards the window. "This way. And wherefore?" "Because the men in the camp were watching the door, and had left the window unguarded." "By Jove, yes!" cried the corporal, seized by new hope. "That does seem more than likely." "Then the men in the camp discovered that those whom they watched had flown, and the cabin is empty. They want them badly, and they follow. Therefore, we find the camp empty like the cabin." "Yes, yes, but where have they gone? Which way in this God forsaken wilderness?" "That we shall know when daylight come. The snow will carry their trail, and we can follow. To then it were better to rest, for the night withholds the knowledge." Corporal Bracknell recognized the wisdom of the Indian's words, and condemned to inaction until daylight, decided to make the best of it. "Then there is nothing for it but to camp, and we may as well use the cabin. Slip through the window, Sibou, and unbar the door, while I go across for Jim and the dogs." Half an hour later a fire was roaring in the improvised stove, and by its light Roger Bracknell wandered round the cabin, searching for anything that would give him a clue to the mystery. He found nothing. The hut, save for a couple of rifles reposing in the corner and some odds and ends of no importance, was quite empty. He looked at the rifles and addressed himself to Sibou. Evidently the ammunition was exhausted. "Yes, therefore the rifles were left, but the food was taken. Behold." The Indian pointed to a roughly made shelf, which corresponded to the ordinary larder of a Klondike cabin. There was nothing there but a coffee sack and an empty syrup tin. "They run from the men in the camp, and leave the rifles because they are useless. But they take the food, and they have a start. 1 hour, 2 hours, who can tell? But we follow in the morning, and we find both. That so?" "Please God, yes," answered the corporal earnestly. Tired out with the labours of the day, Roger Bracknell slept long and well, and woke a little after dawn with the smell of frying bacon in his nostrils. The boy Jim was preparing breakfast, but Sibou was nowhere to be seen. Questioning Jim, he learned that the Indian had gone outside an hour before, and had not yet returned. Hastily throwing on his furs, the corporal passed outside, and as he did so, Sibou appeared at the edge of the woods at the back of the cabin. There was an impassive look on his mask-like face, but his eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Well?" asked the corporal eagerly. The Indian swept a hand towards the woods. "That way have they gone. The double trail is there. Also there's a dead man there." "A dead man?" cried the white man in sudden fear. "An Indian. I know him not." "Take me to him," said the corporal imperatively. Without a word Sibou turned and led the way into the wood, and after a few minutes' walk Roger Bracknell found himself near the mouth of the creek, looking down into the face of a dead man. He recognized him instantly. "He is known to you?" asked Sibou. "Yes, he is known to me. He was the servant of the white man who lived in the cabin." "He was shot in the back with an arrow," explained Sibou. "He must have been looking down at the trail when he died." Roger Bracknell looked at the dead Indian for a little time without speaking. Then fear for what was to come shook him. "Sibou," he said, "we must make haste. There is not a moment to waste. Those men in the camp are very desperate men. 2 men have already died at their hands, and they are now on the trail of the man who is in the hut and of the ladies whom we seek. We must follow hard." "Yes, hard," answered Sibou simply. "It is a trail of death." Half an hour later they were on their way once more. A south wind was blowing, and they travelled with furs opened, for the day was comparatively warm, and there were many signs that spring was at hand. The trail they followed led through the forest for most of the time, but towards the end of the day followed a tributary river, and here it suddenly gathered itself together in a space of trampled snow, which spoke of many pairs of feet. The corporal looked at it in perplexity, and watched Sibou, who circled round and round, seeking a solution of the enigma the trampled snow presented. "What do you make of it, Sibou?" "I'm not sure," answered the Indian slowly. "Something strange has happened. There's been a meeting here, for there are many footmarks, and there is a trail which goes up the river, and the trail of the ladies is not part of it." "But where are they? They certainly came here." "So," answered Sibou, "and they went from here. Since they are not to be found in this place, it is in my mind that they were carried, for there were dogs here as well as men. "But who?" "Indians. The trail is not that of white man's feet." "Then we must follow," cried the corporal. "Yes," answered Sibou gravely, "we must follow. But I shall go first, while you remain here. If I find nothing, then I shall be back in an hour or two. It is in my mind that there is an encampment not far away, and it is better that we do not take the dogs till we know. If they are bad Indians—" "In God's name, hurry!" cried Roger Bracknell, his courage shaken by the thought of the new dangers into which Joy Gargrave appeared to have fallen. Chapter 23. Of the Lady of the North Star by Ottwell Binns. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Prisoners. When Dick Bracknell had led the way from the cabin, he knew that he was leading a forlorn hope. It was possible that many hours would pass before the men in the camp discovered their flight, while on the other hand the discovery might be made immediately, and, in that case, as the ruthlessness of the attackers had shown, there was little hope of escape. But there were dangers before as well as behind, and the wilderness of the north was itself the greatest danger. They had little food, he himself was a very sick man, ill fitted for the strenuous toil which the situation called for, and in the woods wild beasts and wild men might lurk, against whom, armed merely with a pistol and hunting knives, they would be almost helpless. All this he knew, but braced himself for the task before him, determined at all costs to save the two girls and to win Joy's respect, if that was at all possible. When they won to the darkness of the forest without discovery, he breathed more freely and pushed on along an ill-defined track, which he seemed to know well. As the night wore on, he grew unutterably tired, and once, when he was overtaken by a fit of coughing, which left him terribly exhausted, Joy suggested that they should rest for a little while. "Are you too tired to continue?" he asked. "Oh, no," she answered quickly. "Then we will keep on." "But you are not fit to do so," she protested. "Your cough—" "What do I matter?" he replied, with a mirthless laugh. "I am done for in any case, and we must be a long way from here before morning. This is the only service I shall ever be able to render you, and you are not going to deny me the chance of atonement which it gives you, are you?" "I was not thinking of that," answered Joy gently. "I was thinking only of you." "And I am thinking only of you," he retorted quickly. "I have thought of myself too long. I am very glad to have this opportunity of service, however I may regret the circumstances." "I am very grateful to you," was Joy's reply, and without further words they started anew upon their way. Once they stopped and ate a little food which had been prepared before leaving the cabin, and then pushed on until dawn, when a fire was lit and a halt for a couple of hours was made. At the end of that time they resumed their desperate journey, and an hour later struck the river for which Dick Bracknell had been making. A look of relief came on his haggard face as he saw it. "It will be easier now," he said, "and unless the Indians have removed, we shall reach their encampment all right now." "Unless those men overtake us." "Yes, in that case we are up a tree." "And of course if the Indians are hospitable, we— Ah, look there." She indicated a point a little way up the river. A man had emerged from the trees. He stood there regarding them for a moment, then without a sign he withdrew. "An Indian," said Joy quickly. "I am sure of it." "Yes," answered Dick Bracknell slowly, "an Indian. But he may be one of these men who are following us. The question is, what are we to do? Our way lies up the river." "Perhaps it will be better if we take to the woods again," suggested Miss La Farge. "There is little to be gained by doing that," replied Bracknell. "The man has seen us, and if he is hostile he will follow. The only course I think is to keep straight on." They were still discussing when Joy broke in. "The question is solved for us," she said quickly. "There are men in the woods behind us. See!" She had scarcely spoken when an Indian stepped from the wood, and another followed, and another, until 7 men stood on the trail. "How?" said the leader, approaching them. Bracknell replied to the salutation, and the man spoke to his companions, who drew nearer, apparently quite friendly disposed to them. Then came a change. One of the men stepped forward, looked at the white man, and gave a sudden exclamation. Then he turned towards his companions and addressed them volubly. Joy strove to catch what he was saying, but the dialect in which he spoke was strange to her, and she could make nothing of his words. It was clear to her, however, that the man was excited, and as he spoke, the excitement communicated itself to his companions. Joy looked at Dick Bracknell for an explanation, and found that his face was very white. "What is it?" she asked quickly. "Something has gone wrong?" "Yes, terribly wrong. These men will be merciless. I have done you my last disservice." "What do you mean?" she questioned, as she looked at the gesticulating natives. "I did this tribe a grave wrong 2 years ago. One of the men has recognized me, and I think there is little hope for us. We might put up a fight, but it would probably be little use, and would certainly jeopardize your life as well as mine. If they get me, they may let you go. It is worth trying. I will explain, and perhaps—" He broke off and took a step forward. "What are you going to do?" inquired Joy sharply. "I am going to try what a little explanation will do," he answered. "A little explanation coupled with persuasion." "No," she replied quickly. "You are going to make a bargain with these men. I know you are. I shall not agree. We shall stand or fall together." "Do you think you are wise?" he asked. "I do not know whether I am wise or not," she answered firmly, "but I keep the faith of the trail, and I shall not leave you in the lurch. Neither will Babette, I am sure." As he regarded her, a strange look came into his eyes, a look of mingled pride and pain. "Joy," he said brokenly, "you are a great woman, and I was never worthy of you. You can take your chances with me if you like. When I come to think upon it, they are perhaps as good as those that wandering in the wilderness, short of stores, offers. They may spare you, who knows? And it is coming spring. You can feel it in the air. A few days and the river will begin to break up, and then will come white men, prospectors and what not. You may have a chance." "It is by that chance I shall abide," Joy replied, "and not by any that leaves you to the mercy of savages." The Indians finished their confabulation, and the leader stepped forward again, and with lowering looks addressed himself to Dick Bracknell, who nodded, and then handed over his pistol and hunting knife, and with his back to Joy, addressed her in warning. "Keep your pistol out of sight, Joy. These brutes will not suspect you are carrying one, and we may yet find it very useful. They demand that we accompany them to their encampment up the river. I have agreed, since there is nothing else that I can do. I do not think they will hurt you or Miss Lafarge yet." A few minutes later they started, and presently arrived at an encampment consisting of perhaps a score of tepees. Dogs greeted their coming noisily. Children and women came out of the skin tents to look at them, and a few men joined the captors as they moved toward the center of the camp. Just as they halted, an Indian came out of one of the tents, and by his side tottered a man who seemed incredibly old. But though his step was feeble, his eyes were keen, and as they fell on Dick Bracknell they lighted with sudden ferocity, and as she caught the glare he directed towards them, Joy felt the clutch of fear at her heart. "Who is that old man?" she asked. "He knows you. I saw the recognition leap in his eyes." "He's the shaman, the tribal witch doctor, you know. I am afraid his recognition of me is not a propitious one. He is a ferocious old beast, and he owes me one." "What have you done to the tribe?" asked Joy curiously, "that all of them should be against you?" Bracknell laughed shortly. "I am afraid I cannot unfold the record of that particular sin for your gaze. It was a wild, bad thing, but it seemed all right at the time. Now I think I shall have to pay for it, and you too. I seem to be your evil genius," he added penitently. Joy did not reply. She was watching the proceedings of the shaman who, after listening to their captors, tottered up to Bracknell and surveyed him with eyes that were gloating and cruel. Joy shuddered as she read the evil triumph in the old savage's face, and looked at her husband. Apparently he was altogether composed, and there was a contemptuous look on his haggard face. Joy was conscious of a certain thrill of pride as she looked at him. Dick Bracknell might have many weaknesses, but cowardice was not one of them. Then the shaman spoke, mumbling through toothless gums, and though she did not understand a single word of what he was saying, Joy caught the rasping menace in his voice, and shuddered again. The shaman laughed as he broke off, a throaty, croaking laugh, which seemed unutterably evil, and a moment later they were hurried to one of the tepees and the skin door was thrown together and lashed outside. In the darkness Joy spoke. "What was that old savage saying to you, Dick?" Bracknell laughed shortly. "Oh, he was promising himself pleasure and me pain. Indeed, my pain is to be his pleasure." "Ah, you mean they are going to torture you?" "I shouldn't wonder." "Will they be long before?" "To night, I fancy. It seems the tribe is in luck. A couple of moose were killed this morning, and a potlatch, a sort of tribal bean feast, you know, is arranged for to night, and most of them will gorge. The shaman will no doubt arrange some form of entertainment in which I shall take a star part." "Oh, it is dreadful!" cried Joy. In the darkness she heard Dick Bracknell draw his breath sharply, and a second later a hand touched hers. She did not shrink, but remained quite still. Then she heard him speak in a broken, stammering whisper. "My dear, I'm infernally sorry to have brought you into this mess. I " "We shall have to get away before," broke in Joy's voice. "We can't remain here and wait for a thing like that to happen." "What will it matter?" he asked lightly. "It will be the end for me. But if it will save you, I do not care." Joy did not answer. She knew that he was sincere, but she did not know what to say, and presently he spoke again. "I do not know what we can do. If we try to get away, they will follow, and they will travel faster than we shall. And besides, with the food gone, the attempt would be hopeless. One cannot go into the wilderness without grub." They sat discussing the situation quietly, and outside the clamour of the camp grew. Once Joy, finding a small hole in the tent, peeped out. On the edge of the encampment a great fire had been lit, and around it a number of women and men were engaged in trampling the snow hard. She guessed that it was there that the potlatch was to be held, and wondered what would happen when the Indians had feasted. The uncouth figures moving to and fro, and cut out from the deepening darkness by the glow of the fire, seemed inconceivably wild and grotesque, and once, when the strange form of the shaman shuffled into view, and stood gesticulating and pointing to the tepee, she shuddered. She knew that these men were as the men of the Stone Age, that pity was a quality to which they were strangers, and that they would do things which, merely to think of, made her shake with terror. "Oh," she cried sharply, "is there nothing that we—" "Hush!" broke in Dick Bracknell's voice peremptorily. "Listen." All three listened. Someone was fumbling at the back of the tent. Then presently there came a ripping noise, and a voice whispered, "Are you there?" Even at that moment Joy Gargrave's heart leaped as she recognized it. "Yes, Corporal Bracknell, your cousin Babette and myself are here." "Can you move? Are you free?" "Quite free." "Wait a moment, then." The sound of slitting hide was heard once more. Then came the corporal's voice again. "You must slip out through the hole I have cut. Quickly. There is not a moment to lose." Joy felt herself propelled forward and thrust through the opening which the corporal had cut, and while another pair of hands guided her, caught Dick Bracknell's whisper, "Now, Miss Lafarge." Babette slipped out, and 2 seconds later Dick Bracknell followed. "This way," said the corporal quickly, "as silently as you can." He led the way through the darkness to the river bank, and as they began to descend, he whispered to Joy: "Your boy Jim and my man Sibou are waiting for us with the dogs a little way off." "Then Jim is safe?" "Yes, he found me and told me what had happened to By George, listen!" An ear splitting yell sounded from the direction of the encampment. It was followed by another, and that by a great clamour. "They have discovered our escape," said Dick Bracknell grimly. "Hurry! Where are you taking us, Roger? Have you a rifle?" "Yes, I have a rifle." "Then give it to me. Listen to that. The hunt is up." "Give me the gun. I'll hold the pass." As he spoke he laughed, a laugh that sounded harshly in the night, then broke off. "Great Scott! They're in front of us already. Look there!" The dark figures had appeared on the snow in front, but the corporal quickly dispelled the fears their appearance had awakened. "My man and the boy Jim. Hurry! Those beggars behind are following fast." Dick Bracknell looked round. Against the red glare of the great camp fire half a score of dark figures showed plainly. They were running toward the fugitives. An exultant yell told the latter that they had been seen. "For God's sake, give me the rifle and get the girls away, Roger, old man. I'm crocked and can't travel fast, but I can hold those devils back." But "Can't you see this is my chance of doing the decent thing? For God's sake don't deny me, man." Roger Bracknell looked into his cousin's haggard face, and understood. Silently he put his rifle into his cousin's hand, and unbuckling his bandolier, threw it on him. "Thanks, old man, thanks awfully. I'll send my man to back you. When I've started the girls, I'll return myself." "No," replied Dick Bracknell, "you'll go with them. You must. It's necessary." He lifted the rifle as he spoke, and sighting at the foremost of the pursuers, pulled the trigger. "One," he said exultantly, as one of the running shadows toppled into the snow. "The beggars aren't thinking of the light behind them. Go," he said again, "go with the girls and send your man. Let me play the hero for once. Man," he blazed suddenly, "can't you see it is all that is left to me?" "Yes," replied his cousin, "I can see it, and I'll go. But you must promise me that you won't stay longer than—" The rifle cracked again, and then Dick Bracknell replied, "I'll promise anything you like if you'll only go and get Joy away." Then, very reluctantly, Corporal Bracknell went. Chapter 24 of The Lady of the North Star by Ottwell Binns. Recording is in the public domain. The prodigal makes good. "Dick insisted," explained Corporal Bracknell, as with Joy and her foster sister and the boy Jim he fled down the river. "I could see he wanted the post of danger, and I could not refuse. Sibou is with him, and I think they will hold the pursuit." For a moment Joy did not speak. She was thinking of the consideration Dick Bracknell had shown to her during the last 2 days, and understood quite well that now he was endeavoring to atone for the wrong he had once done her. Pity surged in her heart as she thought of him weak and ill, holding back a horde of savage men. Pity and gratitude, but no warmer emotion, for Dick Bracknell had killed all possibility of that in that moment at Alcombe when, on her marriage morning, she had made that startling discovery of his perfidy. "Do you think that Dick will get away also?" she asked at last. "I hope so," the corporal answered evasively. "I made him promise not to stay too long. But he's a sick man and in the mood for anything. I believe he rejoiced at the prospect of a fight against odds. It is not surprising, and listen! There they go again. They were both together that time." From time to time, as they raced hotfoot down the trail, the reports of rifles reached them, and they knew that the fight was still proceeding, and that the 2 defenders were holding their own. Once, when the interval between the shots was especially long, Corporal Bracknell's face grew very thoughtful, and so absorbed and intent was he that Joy addressed the question to him twice before he heard her. "Corporal Bracknell, do you think that Dick can recover from his sickness?" "I'm afraid not," replied the corporal slowly, then gave an ejaculation as the distant report of a rifle broke the silence behind them. "Good! They're still keeping it up." "Why do you think that?" she asked. "Because I have seen other men like it. I have never known one to recover." Do you think Dick knows?" "Yes," he answered quietly. "I am sure of it." "It is very pitiful," she said. "He is not all bad." "He is very far from being that," interrupted the corporal. "He might have made good even yet, if he were not so sick." "Perhaps he is making good," replied the corporal gently. "Yes," she answered simply. "I think he is trying. In spite of the past, I shall be in his debt." "Ah, what is that?" There had been a sudden increase of clamor behind them. Distant yells were sounding, and the two rifles were firing in rapid succession. For perhaps a minute and a half this went on. Then came silence, followed by a single shot, and that again by a silence which remained unbroken. Corporal Bracknell stopped irresolutely. "What do you think?" Joy whispered. "I think it is the end one way or the other," was the reply. "The last yells sounded as if the Indians were charging. In that case, unless the rush was stopped—" "Dick and your man are dead?" "Something of that kind. I think I must go back and try and learn what has happened. There is nothing else for it. I simply can't desert them without knowing what has befallen. You keep right on until you reach the main river. I will not be longer than necessary." "We shall wait at the fork," she answered quickly. "But—" "We shall wait," she repeated resolutely, and taking a rifle from one of the sleds, she handed it to him. "You may need it," she said quietly, "and we have one left yet." He did not speak, but nodding his thanks, turned in the tracks and proceeded up river once more. He went swiftly but cautiously, and after traveling half an hour, caught sight of a lumpy shadow coming down the river. Hastily he took refuge against the bank and waited with his rifle ready. The shadow drew nearer, and then he perceived that it was made up of two men, one riding on the back of the other. At the same time he caught the sound of a protesting voice. "It's not worth while, old horse. Put me down and quit, they say." A moment later Roger Bracknell was running towards them. "Dick! Dick!" he cried gladly. "Where are the girls, Joy?" asked his cousin in a voice that sounded harsh. "They are all right. They are well in front." "Good." There was a note of relief in Dick Bracknell's voice as he spoke. Then he gave a little laugh. "Behold the victors, Roger, my son. It was topping. We stood a charge and cleared the board. It was gorgeous." He laughed weakly, and his cousin looked at him anxiously. "But you are hurt, Dick, old man." "Plugged with an arrow in the ribs. Sibou's all right, though, and I tried to make him leave me on the field of glory, but—" "He's a mutinous beggar." Weak though he was, there was a reckless gaiety in his manner which almost moved the corporal to tears. "Dick, don't you think you had better not talk? It is bound to try you as you are. When we get to the sleds I will look to your wound and—" "Not a bit of use, Roger, my boy. I know it, you know it. This finishes me. It was a matter of weeks before. Now it's a matter of hours. All the same, I'd like to see Joy before—" "You shall, if it is to be done," said his cousin, as the other's voice broke. "I'll take turns with Sibou. Between us we'll do it, somehow. And I might as well take part of my share now. Sibou must be fagged." They stopped and the transfer was effected. Then as they resumed their way, the wounded man leaned over his cousin's shoulder and whispered, "Roger, you're a good sort." The corporal made no response, and Dick Bracknell continued, "You know that Joy was up here looking for you?" "The boy Jim told me so, though why she should—" She came to tell you that Jeff was dead, that you are the heir of Harrow Fell." "No, no," broke out his cousin in sharp protest. "Yes, yes, it is so. I've been out of it since, oh, for years. And in any case I shall be out of it altogether very soon. But it wasn't for that only that Joy came. She came up here to stop you from killing me. Knowing the relation between us, she was afraid that if that happened, people would say that you you understand." "Yes, I think I understand." "Such a possibility was rather rot, of course, but Joy didn't know that, and she knew that you were after me, so she's pure gold, Joy is." "Yes," agreed the corporal simply. "You'll marry her, of course, and go to the Fell?" Roger Bracknell hesitated. The conversation was inexpressibly painful to him, and to this question he did not know what answer to make. His cousin did not seem to notice the hesitation, and he did not wait for an answer, but continued in a broken way. "There have been Bracknells at the Fell these 500 years, and Jeff's gone, and I'm going, but you'll keep up the line. When you've a boy, Roger, call him Dick. I'd like to think there'll be one of my name who'll be as clean and straight as I've been crooked. Lord, what a mess a man can make of life. And what a difference it would have made if only I'd gone straight at the fences. But would it? Joy would never have married me. She never loved me. But you have her heart. Oh, it is so. I'm not blind, and, Roger, old man, I'm glad it will be you." After that he was silent for a long time, to Roger's unutterable relief, and he spoke only jestingly on the occasions when Sibou and the corporal took him over from the other, and at last, after a weary march, they reached the point where the stream joined the main river, and as they did so a figure broke from the bank and ran towards them. It was Joy. "You're all here," she cried. "Safe?" "Safe, yes," laughed Dick wearily, "but a little damaged." "What is it?" she asked, turning towards the corporal. "Dick is wounded," he answered gravely. "I am afraid it is serious, and as I think we have little to fear from the Indians now, it will perhaps be best if we cross the main river and camp. We can put him upon one of the sleds." "Yes, yes," she cried, and a moment later she had turned to the wounded man, and was talking to him in a low voice. Roger moved away. He did not know what she was saying, and he had no wish to know. But half an hour later, as his cousin lay by a fire which had been lit, he saw that his eyes were shining with a quiet happiness. "Better, Dick?" he inquired. "In soul, yes," was the answer. "I'm glad of that," replied the corporal simply. "It's like a cleansing to have a good woman's approval. You can't know, Roger, old boy. You haven't been deep in the mire. But there it is." He allowed his cousin and Joy to examine his wound, and they found the arrow broken off in his side. The corporal looked at the girl and shook his head. There was little to be done except draw out the arrow and bandage the wound as well as they could, and when that was done the injured man was visibly weaker. Corporal Bracknell busied himself with the preparation of a meal, leaving Joy and his cousin together, and not till after the meal, when Dick was dozing, had he any opportunity of further speech with Joy. Then walking in the shadow of the trees, he talked with her. "Dick has told me why you came," he said, going straight to his point. "I am very grateful." "I was afraid that there might be trouble between you," she answered frankly. "We had already met twice before you came," he explained quietly. "On the first occasion Dick spared my life, and on the second, though the meeting began stormily enough, we parted complete friends." "I am glad of that, more glad than I can tell." "No more than I am, but there are things I want to ask you, very badly. I know how you came to go to Dick's cabin, but I do not know who those men were who kept both Dick and you there in a state of siege. Have you any idea?" As he asked the question, Joy Gargrave's face grew very thoughtful. "It was Dick's man who fastened the door on us. That was part of a plan for kidnapping me, which Dick had arranged, and at first I thought that he " "It was not Joe. We found him shot," interrupted the corporal. "I do not think it was he now. At first Dick was inclined to that idea, and then he thought it might be my boy, Jim. But I pointed out that the latter would scarcely attack Babette, and she was attacked while walking outside the hut, you know." He looked at her and saw that her eyes were full of trouble. She was keeping something back, and after a moment he pressed her for the truth. "You have suspicions, Miss Gargrave? Tell me exactly what you think." "I scarcely like to," was the reply. "What I have is no more than a suspicion, and it is almost too horrible for words." "Tell me," he urged again. "I will," she broke out impulsively, "and God forgive me if I do him wrong. I think my cousin Adrian was responsible. Mr. Rayner, you know, whom you met at North Star." "I thought so." "You thought so?" she cried. "Then you know he was up here?" "I did not know, but I guessed. I was on his trail when I met your boy Jim." "And he was on yours, I am sure," said Joy quickly. "He followed you when you left Dick's cabin. I think he meant to kill you. He knew that you suspected him of that attack on Dick at North Star." "I suspected him of worse things than that." "Yes, I know. Dick told me. Oh, how terrible it is!" She hid her face in her hands for a moment, and then, as she lifted it, he asked, "Have you any idea why he should do a thing like that, or why he should make an attempt upon you?" "Yes," she replied in a shaking voice. "Babette, who is very frank, says he wants my money. He would have married me, knowing all the time that I was married to Dick. He even threatened me when I would not accept him, and events have compelled me to the belief that Babette is right, and that he will allow nothing to stand in his way, not even my life." Roger Bracknell nodded his head thoughtfully. "I think you are right," he answered slowly. "We must be very careful. If there is real warrant for our suspicions, then Adrian Rayner will be a very desperate man." "I am sure of that," she interjected impulsively. "I felt it when he left North Star on our arrival. Did I tell you that he was there when we came back? No? Well, he was. I ordered him away, and as soon as I could I came to look for you. It was good of you to be so anxious for my welfare," he broke in quickly. They had turned and were walking back to the fire, and in the light it shed he saw her face grow suddenly crimson. She looked towards the recumbent figure of Dick Bracknell lying towards the fire, then back again to himself. "That was but natural," she said quietly. "You were working for me, and when I knew that a danger unknown to you threatened you, I felt that I must make you aware of it. You understand?" "Yes," he answered quietly, "and if we can only meet Adrian Rayner, we shall be able to prove or disprove all that we suspect. You and Babette and myself know him, and Sibou knows the man who was responsible for your father's death. If Adrian Rayner and he should prove to be the same, then the matter will be beyond dispute." "Yes," she agreed slowly. "Yes, but it will be very terrible." They approached the fire just as Dick Bracknell moved and opened his eyes. He looked at Joy, and she, reading the unspoken request in his eyes, went and seated herself by his side. Chapter 24